Greetings, everyone. Good evening, at least here in New Hampshire where I am. It's evening, 7 o'clock in the evening. Welcome to the third episode of Lighthearted Live. I'm Jeremy D'Entremont, and I'm the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. So after 8 years of doing recorded audio podcasts, we decided to do something new. And I really enjoy doing these live streams, although sometimes I wish I had a 10-year-old to help me because I think 10-year-olds understand a lot of this stuff better than I would, but we're doing our best. So let me introduce our co-host this evening. Our co-host should be familiar to anyone who's listened to the podcast for a while. She's been involved since the very start, which is like 7 years ago. 7 years ago now. Hard to believe. And Michelle has co-hosted well over 100 episodes. Michelle Jewel Shaw is also the chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hey, Michelle.
Hey, Jeremy, and hello to everybody out there watching us.
So, and I also want to mention that Ralph Krugler of the U.S. Lighthouse Society is helping out behind the scenes. Ralph is a lighthouse historian and author. Lives in Florida, and Ralph will be monitoring the chat and helping out in various ways behind the scenes and possibly jumping in and saying hi at some point. Let's introduce tonight's guest, Therese Woelfel. Therese lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and she has held leadership roles in Fortune 500 companies, entrepreneurial endeavors, and nonprofit organizations. Her new book, Our Guiding Light, is her first nonfiction work. Therese's grandfather, Charles A. Linsmeier, was a Lighthouse Service keeper at several stations. In fact, I think it was 9 on the Great Lakes, 9 light stations from 1920 to 1953. And the book tells the story of his daughter, Vivian, who was Therese's mother. And Michelle, I think you have an excerpt from the book description to read.
I do. Quote, "A lighthouse doesn't calm the storm. It simply reminds you where the shore is and says you are being cared for and watched over." From her parents and the other lighthouse keepers they knew, Vivian learned some of the most valuable lessons of her life. Honesty and service to others. As she navigated her life, living through the Great Depression and World War II, standing up to social injustice and raising 8 children, she surrendered to the divine and allowed herself to be watched over. In turn, she was able to be a steady beacon of light and hope for those who encountered life's storms.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome, Therese. So nice to see you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is exciting.
You were on the podcast, on the audio podcast last October. And we haven't talked too much since then. I'm just wondering, the book was pretty new, right? It had come out not long before we talked last.
End of July, it came out. So the ink was still wet when we talked.
Right. Yeah, we actually talked. I interviewed you in August. I think it was posted on the podcast in October. So since then, since we talked last year, how has the reception been to the book?
It's been really fantastic. All kinds of cool things are happening. First of all, the Lighthouse community, as everyone on this call knows, is pretty special. And I've had people reaching out from all over our country, as well as a few international people who have either found me through your podcast or through the book and have shared their stories, their Lighthouse stories, or sometimes even a little bit more of their kind of spiritual stories and things that go along with lighthouses. So that's been incredible. And in addition to having the book published, it's been written up in 3 different publications, so including the U.S. Lighthouse Society, the Keeper's Log, the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, and we have a magazine in Wisconsin that reaches about 100,000 people called Our Wisconsin. So it's just really exciting to see how this book has really taken off. And I just got news that it's going. I wrote an article and submitted it to one of the largest, I would say, inspirational type of magazines that's worldwide. I'm not going to name the name today because it's. I just received word that it's going to be published, but it reaches over 7 million people. Wow. And it's an article that I pulled out of the book about my daughter when she was younger and kind of an angel visit that she had and how it kind of changed my life and how I looked at life moving forward. So it's been very exciting.
When you were on the podcast last time, I just want to maybe say a little bit more about you this time than we can get into last time. You've had a really distinguished career in the business world and the nonprofit world. and we can't cover all of it. Maybe we need another episode for that. But could you kind of give us the Cliff's Notes version of that part of your life?
Sure. Well, and interesting, if you had my dad's version of it, he once said to me, if you keep changing jobs every 3 years, no one's ever going to hire you. To which my mom said, every time, I change jobs, I'm gaining more, experience and knowledge and applying it in new ways and whatnot. So anyway, I graduated from a college in Wisconsin, and then I moved out to California for about 8 or 9 years. Got my master's degree out there, and that's the time where my career really took off, and I just got in some leadership roles, really cool leadership roles. There was 2 Fortune 500 companies that came together and wanted to start an entrepreneurial startup, and I was on a very small team of people that got to create a company from ground up. Super exciting. And then throughout my career, in my younger years, I was climbing the ladder, doing all the work, marketing, sales, leadership roles. But towards the end of my career, that's where I really slowed down and took a look at my career and looked at my mother's life and kind of really thought about what's important and using the skills that I've acquired to actually give back to people and really support the nonprofit world and really lift others. So that was kind of the defining moment in my career, I would say, is the last 5 to 7 years where I really took stock of my life, what a lot of people do, and just said, hey, what's really important? And I was able to do some really interesting work here in our state of Wisconsin.
What inspired you to write the book?
Well, this is the coolest story. You guys ready for this? So when my mother passed, and she had a terrible illness. It was like Parkinson's, only on steroids. It's called what's parasupernuclear palsy. And it's a very debilitating disease. And so the last 9 years of her life, she continued to just, lose her abilities to speak and to, hand movements and functions. She was falling, all the things that you would see with Parkinson's, only really, we always said, like on steroids, so much more severe. As these things were taking place, she really displayed such grace and dignity. And in ways where I think she raised the bar so high. I always told her she was never sad, never spiteful, never thought of herself. She only thought of others and the caregivers and the people who were helping her. But it was at her memorial service, at her funeral in a small church in northern Wisconsin, where my nephew got up to say a few words, Eric. And he said, he kind of leaned into the microphone and at the end and said, let's just give Vivian a standing ovation for a life well lived. And the church, everyone jumped to their feet in the most sincere round of applause I've ever witnessed in my life, in the standing ovation. So it shocked me. I knew I felt that way about her, but I just didn't realize that people that came all over from the country, all over the place, they came for her service, and they jumped to their feet. And as I looked at their faces, I kind of describe it in the book. It was like a black and white movie where someone's face would come forward and I would see a very clear emotion, whether it was joy, gratitude, loss, grief, love. It was very clear to me. And it was a moment where I realized that I wasn't clear on how I was feeling. I knew she was an amazing woman and I missed her, but I didn't understand how this small kind of selfless nature could create such impact. So about a month later, I was talking with my husband, Andy, and I said, I'm going to write an article called Standing Ovation, and it's going to challenge people to live their life in such a way that causes people to, jump to their feet, really understanding, why we're on earth. And I talked smack about it for about 4 years and did nothing. And the reason I did nothing is I didn't understand the premise I knew she was an amazing woman, but I didn't get it. I didn't understand what it was. So 4 years to the exact day of her memorial service, and I didn't realize this until writing the book and going back and looking at the date. It was 4 years to the day of her standing ovation. I threw a coin in the Trevi Fountain in Rome, Italy. My husband and I were in Italy. My daughter was studying abroad in Florence, so we went to visit her. I threw a coin in the fountain. I was at a kind of a crossroads in my career, trying to decide how I was going to give back, what I was going to do towards the end of my career. And I threw the coin in and I just said, what is my purpose? What is my life purpose? And we turned away and my husband said, hey, everyone's walking into this church across the street. Let's follow them. So we walked into these massive, by the way, I am just I love these huge doors in Italy. I mean, they're just massive wooden doors with buckles and things like we don't really see quite as much in our country. We walk through these massive doors, and as soon as I stepped foot into the church, I had tears flooding down my face. And it wasn't like I was crying. It was just raw emotion like I've never felt before. And then everything dimmed for me in the church. And the only thing that I saw was the Blessed Mother, and she was glowing. So I walked down the aisle. I kind of put my hand up to my husband, and because he said, "What's happening?" And I just put my hand up and I just walked down by myself, and I lit a votive candle, and I said, "What is my life purpose? Show me and tell me. What am I supposed to be doing with my life?" And I heard the words from the Blessed Mother, "Write the book." And that was the exact moment where I knew this article was a book. Wasn't really loving the idea. So I said, "I don't know how to write a book." And she said, "She will help you." And this same incident happened a few days later in Florence. Same situation. We walked into a church. I saw the Blessed Mother. I lit a votive candle, thanked her for Vivian being my mother. I felt her presence. My mom had been gone for 4 years. So I said, "What is my life purpose?" And she said, again, "Write the book." And when I said, "I don't know how to write a book," my mother said, "I will help you." And that's the moment that I knew I would be, more of the vessel for this book than actually, writing the book. There was a book that was meant to be written. So, and then here's the part where my snarky personality comes through is a few days later, I'm sitting on a rooftop in Florence and on a hotel, and I have a glass of wine, and I literally look up in the sky and I said, "Look, God, if you want me to write a book, you are going to be busy, and you're going to need to show me the way." And it was like I was having this temper tantrum like a 2-year-old would have. And, you can imagine a parent watching and nothing happens. You're just waiting for it to happen. And I was so frustrated. So I finally said, really snotty, I said, "Hey, if you want me to write this book, you're going to be busy showing me the way." And I flipped open this magazine, and it went right to an article of Michelangelo. They asked him how he painted the Sistine Chapel. And he said, "I didn't. I held the brush." And that was the exact moment that it was confirmed for me that I would just be the vessel for this work. And so although my name is on the book, and yes, I did the work, and it was a lot of work, research, pulling things together to write this book, I feel like, there should be other names on this book alongside, including my mother's. Every time I sign a book, I sign her name as well. She definitely helped. And it was a very spiritual journey for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. So your grandfather became a lighthouse keeper in 1920. He was a sailor before that. Can you tell us about what happened in a storm in 1913?
Sure can. This is a crazy story. These are the stories that, this book is episodic, meaning like all these little stories, they're all story, and it all goes together to be a book. And a lot of these stories we heard as children from our mother. These are the stories she told about her dad. So it was 1913. It was the Great Storm of 1913, and 2 storm fronts converged and created, hurricane-type conditions, 35-foot waves, freezing waves. So as they surfaced over a ship, it would freeze and create top-heavy situations and dangerous situations. It was whiteout, blizzard conditions. And it was 3 or 4 days. My grandfather was at that time 21 years old. He was on a boat. He left Detroit, Michigan, and he was on his way to Buffalo, New York. And he was on a tugboat that was pulling a barge full of lumber. And there were just a few people on that boat. And the captain then stationed them in ships so that there was 24-hour coverage of a man standing with an axe watching the line between the tugboat and the barge, so that if the barge went down, they were supposed to chop it free so that they wouldn't be pulled down to their death as well. And this storm went on for, as I said, 3 or 4 solid days. And dozens of ships were capsized, and hundreds of lives were lost. There were, there were sailors that were washing up on shore for weeks later with the name of their boat on the back of their life jacket. So as they were getting close to Buffalo, New York, they had no idea where they were, and all of a sudden they had this sighting of the Buffalo lightship. They found that, and they started heading towards the Buffalo Harbor. And when they actually got to the harbor, like a day later, the Buffalo lightship floated by inverted, and all 6 of the people that were manning the Buffalo lightship perished and it capsized. So it was just a tragic thing. All four of the four people were left on my grandfather's boat at the end, and they were frozen, and they were gathered together, huddled together. They lived. And I think that my grandfather, who became a Great Lakes lighthouse keeper then, really understood the seriousness of, what the Great Lakes can produce, and then also the importance of the lighthouse and the beacons and the lightships. He took it very seriously.
Yeah. Well, maybe you just answered it. I was going to ask you, why did he become a lighthouse keeper? But maybe you want to say a little bit more about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, after the storm, he met who was Esther Phillips, who was going to become my grandmother. And being a sailor, you sailed 7 days a week. There was the only time you ever were able to come back to your family was if you jumped ship, and then you'd visit your family and you'd find another ship to hop on. So he knew that was no life for a family. And so he looked into based on his experience, he looked into becoming a lighthouse keeper. And he actually was assigned into North Manitou, which is in the northern part of Lake Michigan. And he and my grandmother left Michigan, headed over towards, it's usually a 4-hour trip, took 17 days to get there. And it was because of the tremendous ice that they had that year. So as the ship got close to the island, dropping him off for his, first tour as a lighthouse keeper, everything they owned were in 2 trunks. And the captain said, "Hey, I can't get you any closer." And he basically dropped them off on the ice with their 2 trunks. My grandmother was 7 months pregnant at this time. And so my grandfather went to shore about a mile or so away and found a horse that could help him pull, a sleigh to help pull their trunks. And that was the beginning of the service on North Manitou. And mind you, I'm the youngest of the 8 children. And so my grandfather died about 2 months before I was born. So writing this book was just a lot of research. There were my mother's journals. She really was dedicated to preserving the lighthouse keepers' way of life and their family, and making sure that it was published. She was published continually in articles that she wrote, but she had journals and family letters, Christmas letters. Everything was recapping the lighthouse keepers' way of life, and so I really had to lean heavily on that. And as well as I contacted through the National Archives, I hired someone to resurrect my grandfather's, all of the light journals. And so I could read about what they did every day and who was there and what they encountered. And the significant stories in this book were all documented, including this one, were all documented. I was able to find every one of the major stories documented in the words of the head keeper, which to me was like extremely fascinating. And all of those pictures, or all of those books, were photographed, every page, and then I donated them to some of the local maritime museums so that information is all sitting there in the National Archives. I hired a researcher, as I said, because I'm not skilled in that way. And it was just fascinating to me to have that in my hands, as well as I received about a 4-inch packet from the Coast Guard with my grandfather's, his history and his lighthouse career. So just fascinating information.
Your grandfather was keeper at 9 different lighthouses. Did your mom have a favorite lighthouse?
Well, I'll tell you, I learned this. It's interesting you'd ask that, Michelle, because as the youngest, I just didn't know as much as some of my siblings. So there was a lot of information passed to me as well. But in the lighthouses, she was born in Milwaukee at North Point Lighthouse. So she was born there. Her brother was born there. Her mother was still living and was there. So they were a family there. So I feel like there's a really strong connection to the North Point Lighthouse, the Breakwater, and the Pierhead in Milwaukee. That's really significant. They moved they were there until my mother was about 8 or 9 years old. Then they moved to Sheboygan. When they moved to Sheboygan, that's where her mother actually, she drowned. So she had, like a lot of people did because of food sources and whatnot, she had an enlarged goiter, and she had thyroid conditions. So she went out for a walk in the evening. This is my grandmother. And she didn't come back. And that night, my grandfather went looking for her, and he found her. She had drowned. The mast of a sailboat had swung and hit her and knocked her into the river. So Sheboygan was a very hard place for my mom to live. But at the same time, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's also really great memories there as well. And then she also lived at the Raleigh Point or Twin River Point Lighthouse, which is in the Two Rivers, Wisconsin area. So, but I would say, to answer your question, Michelle, as I was writing the book, on the cover, I put the Raleigh Point Lighthouse because it really was something that, as a family, we really focused on that lighthouse. But here's a little secret for everybody here on this call is, as you look through the book, and I'll show you this, you'll see these page breaks and you'll see this lighthouse. This is where, thank you. This is where I pulled through the Milwaukee Lighthouse, because in the major breaks in the book, as I really started to understand my mother and her life and all that she went through throughout her life, I wanted to pull, I think what would be her happiest and favorite lighthouse would be Milwaukee, because that's where her mother was still living, her brother was born. And it was just a very, even though it was the Depression and whatnot, I think it was just a really solid family time for them.
Did your mother talk much about her childhood at the lighthouses?
Yeah, she did. But it's interesting. So with her mother passing, and my mom was age 9, so she and her brother woke up to sirens, and that was the point where her mother had drowned. My mom stepped into the role of caregiver for her brother and kind of woman of the house as far as cooking and cleaning and trying to take care of the things that she could. And so she didn't talk about that a lot because she didn't talk about it from a sad point. My mom always looked at everything from a kind of a position of generosity and how she could help others. But I did find something in her journal that I want to just read to you, because this was fascinating. Her journal was so eye-opening. When she's talking about the Sheboygan Lighthouse where her mother drowned, she said, while it wouldn't have been uncommon during this time for a father to send his children to live with relatives, my father chose to keep our family together. I admired him for this and thought he was the kindest person I had ever known. Despite our intense sadness, our father guided us through this tragedy. He spent many evenings teaching us about the stars and constellations. As a sailor, he understood the importance of the North Star to guide the way. As our father, he knew the heavens would temporarily put our sadness on hold as our minds and souls filled with wonder. Each night, the lighthouse keepers and their families gathered together in their quarters. The men would keep us spellbound with stories of their sailing and lighthouse days. So I think we learn more about her life from her journal than maybe her sharing some of those more difficult things with us.
Obviously, your mother's mother dying had an effect on her, and there were other hardships certainly in her childhood. And you've spoken to this already to some point, but how did that shape her life? Both the hardships and the life of being a lighthouse keeper's daughter.
Well, I know that integrity and being truthful and faithful, serving others, was really the core of who she was as a lighthouse keeper's daughter and what she witnessed from the lighthouse keepers. There's a lot of quotes throughout the book where she talks about those are the formative moments in her life, her brother and she had a sister later on in life. Those were all formative moments, and having the foundation of the lighthouse keeper's way of life was really was key. But after her mother died, years later, they were moved as a family. My grandfather was transferred to Raleigh Point Lighthouse, and this is where he actually served and became head keeper for the first time in 1944, and he served until 1953. So during this time, it was very wholesome time. There was the croquet, all the things that you read about. There was the winter when they strapped on skis and they skied down their sand dunes on Lake Michigan, and all the wonderful things that they went through. But not long after they went to the Raleigh Point, or sometimes referred to as Twin River Point, not long after that, my grandfather remarried, and so. The stepmother, for about a year, they lived together. And then after that, my mother had said she had heard her stepmother say a few times, there's too many women in the kitchen. She was very unhappy with my mother and her brother Chuck living with them in the Lighthouse. So my mother was age 14 and her brother was only 13 when her stepmother moved them out of the house. And they moved in with families they didn't know in Two Rivers, and a local town where their high school was. And not even the same home. They were separated into separate homes. So my mother became the caregiver for a family that had young children. And, my mother didn't talk a lot about it, but my dad sure did, especially after my mom was gone. The last 9 years of his life, I was able to ask him a lot of questions, and he was very bitter about, and I think many people would be, the way all of this played out. But, there was a can of soup that would have to last for 2 or 3 days because she had to pay for her room and board as well as take care of these children. And her brother Chuck, who was only 13 years old, he had, paper routes, whatever he could do, he was supposed to pay for his way of living. And at the same time, they received checks from the Coast Guard, I take that back. Yeah, it was Coast Guard. They received checks because their mother had passed, and those checks were not given to them. The stepmother kept that money. So when I asked my dad about it, I said, gosh, that's just, it's awful. It's hard to even imagine that type of thing taking place. But, he was very bitter about it, but he said, your mother never was. She forgave immediately. And when I asked my mother about it later in life, and I said, how on earth did you forgive that? And she told me it's important to be generous and kind. So she just had she's just a solid person, a beacon of light for others, and never thought about herself, which is, gosh, I wish a little more of that had gotten passed along to all of us. It's a pretty high bar set, but I think a lot of it has to do with just their upbringing.
How did your mother meet your father, and how long were they married?
They were married. They were married a long time. They were together about 70 years. So my father came from a local family in Two Rivers, near the Lighthouse, and his father owned a garage and a service garage. So he was filling up the gas in his for my grandfather Charlie, and my mom was in the car, and they were kind of looking at each other, and they ended up being in the same geometry class and whatnot. So they knew who each other were, but they hadn't formally met. So they would kind of, like my dad said, as soon as I saw her, I just perked up. I knew she was the one, which is, a fun story. But when her stepsister, so Judy, was born, and she was my godmother, and she was a wonderful woman as well. And when Judy was born, Chuck, so my mother's brother, was riding his bicycle. He wanted to go tell Vivian that they had a new sister, and he happened to be riding by my dad, Norbert's house. And my dad said, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to tell Vivian about our new sister. So my dad said, can I ride along? And so he tagged along, and that was the beginning of their love story right there. They started, obviously my mother was delighted to hear about her sister, and then also the opportunity to meet my dad. So they started dating. And the funny story is my dad said the first date was they went to an Abbott and Costello movie. And he said, that's the first time I ever held your mother's hand through her mitten. It was just such innocent times.
Yeah.
Right.
That's so sweet.
Did you say it already? How many years were they married?
Well, I'm trying to guess on the number. I'm going to say it was 65 years.
Yeah,
They were
I think I looked at his obituary. I think it was 67. I think it's 67.
That makes sense. 67.
That's absolutely incredible. Yeah. So I want to talk more about your father, but let me ask you a question. Coincidences, premonitions, maybe you could even say visions kind of figure in your story. And you already talked about the kind of visions you had that led to writing the book, really. Mm-hmm. Your grandfather had an interesting dream or premonition. I mean, we talked about this before. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing really fascinates me. So can you tell about that particular dream?
I sure can. Yeah, well, my mom, first of all, raising us, always told us to pay attention to how you feel. You'll know if you're excited or if you're sad. Think about what it is and pay attention to what's happening around you. So I'm not sure if she was just more in tune being raised by her father, but shortly after my grandmother drowned, my mom woke up in the morning and she was surprised to see her dad was still home because he was supposed to be helping someone on a farm just down the road. So she said, she asked him, why are you here? Why aren't you there? And he said, well, I had a really vivid dream last night. The barn burnt down. And he said, it was more than a dream. I knew it was true. And so there's no reason to go. And my mom was just kind of floored by that as a little girl. But she said, he checked later and it was true. So I asked my mom about that. And I said, well, what do you think about that? How do you even think about this? And mom said, she goes, just because you put a clock on the wall or you hang a calendar doesn't mean time happens in such a linear way. So she feels as though there are many dimensions in this world and in heaven and beyond, as well as, the sequence of time doesn't happen exactly like we think. There's all kinds of things in astronomy with black holes and all kinds of things. So she believed in time travel. She believed that almost anything was possible. So she basically just said, you really need to pay attention. And I think her passion for astronomy came from her father, teaching her about the constellations and whatnot and all of the mysteries. So that was a lifelong fascination for her. But she also believed in synchronicities, and she believed in, the messages from butterflies and from cardinals and all of these things that you hear about. And I witnessed that throughout her life, that this is true. And it's something I adopted as a young person because of her talking about them and understanding. So, I've learned, and I also know when I'm ignoring signs that are coming my way. Later on, you can always look back, but I do believe that there's messages around us at all times. And here's a story, Jeremy, I haven't told you because it happened since we talked last, but I had this really, really vivid dream. Okay, I'm just going to lay this out for you. And it was more than a dream. And I was walking down a paved path along Lake Michigan, no idea where I was. But I remember looking to my left and seeing the water and thinking just how it fills our souls, and in lighthouse keepers and our families, how it's just in our souls. And I was walking and was very happy. And all of a sudden I heard, Therese. And I looked to my left, and my grandfather was standing out there, and he was waving, and he said, thank you. And he yelled it twice. And I woke up and I felt like it was more than a dream. I knew that even though I had never met him, I met him then. And that he was coming forward to thank me for pulling this book together and to making sure that we're honoring the lives of lighthouse keeper families.
Wow, that's really powerful.
That's amazing.
Real quick story. It just makes me think. I'll make this quick, but when I was growing up, there was a historian named Edward Rowe Snow who was super popular. And I know some of our people viewing this will know who he was. He was the flying Santa to lighthouses for many years. So huge influence on me. He's the reason I did any of this stuff. I met him a couple of times in his life, but some years after he died, I had the most vivid dream where I was sitting on a boat with him when he was pulling out maps and things and documents and showing them to me and telling fascinating stories. And it was so much like I was right there with him. I mean, like you said, when you said more than a dream, I immediately thought of that. So, anyway, I believe in such things as well.
So can you tell us more about your father? He was a pilot, right?
Yeah, he was. So he was, we always say born to fly, because when he was, I think, 5, I have a little picture of him. He was 5 or 6 years old. He had a hat that said aviator on the front, and he knew he was going to be a pilot. He read every airplane book there was in the Two Rivers Library by the time he was 16. And when he was 16, he saved up some money and he went to a local airport and he went for his first airplane ride. The next day, he rode his bike out by my mother, and they rode together to the airport, and they both went on their second airplane ride. So my mom's first and his second. And so he was born to fly. We have kind of a standing joke in the family because over the years, he became a commercial airline pilot, but there was quite a journey, to get there. He was in the war. He traveled 65,000 miles, 14 countries. This young man from Two Rivers lied about his age to get into World War II. And so he traveled the world and he saw a lot. And he actually flew on missions where they would find, 2 or 3 airplanes from the war that had crashed or had fallen apart or whatnot. And then they would, as he was an airplane mechanic, they would put the airplanes together. They would fly out as many as they can. And they continued to do that throughout the war. So when he came home to Two Rivers, He and my mother managed airports for about 5 years all over the state of Wisconsin. So they would go in there, and my mom would do the rib stitching on the airplane, and she would do the books, and my dad would do all of the mechanical, anything that needs to be fixed. And he was making 90 cents an hour, and he got a big raise to 95 cents an hour because he was doing such a great job. Then he went to work for Kimberly-Clark Corporation here in Wisconsin. They became a mechanic/pilot. And from there, he went to work for American Airlines. But the funny story in our family is a lot of my mom's friends would say, "Did you marry him for his uniform?" And she would always say, "When I married him, his uniform went in the last wash of the Ringer washing machine because he was covered in grease." He was an airplane mechanic. But throughout his career, it's pretty impressive. You know, he was of the generation that introduced jets into the airline industry. He flew one of the first 3 jets for American Airlines and became a pilot of 747s. He flew, after I went to college, being the youngest, they moved to Arizona so he could fly to Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, in that direction. Then they moved to Texas so he could, expand his flying to all over the world. And then he ended up retiring. He retired in Florida and then moved back to Wisconsin. But his career, right now, I have in my possession every logbook from every flight he's ever taken, every flight he's ever flown, excuse me. And I have them all in a box, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with them because it's kind of museum material. This is a person who actually introduced jets into the airline industry. And it's kind of, I think, feels like it's very historic. So when I look at both of their historic backgrounds, Lighthouse Keeper's daughter comes from that family. Marries an airline pilot who fought in World War II, and they survived the Great, Depression, and then, raised 8 children and became serious advocates for fighting against social injustice. They were pretty impressive pair.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, as you just said, you're one of 8 kids. And I'm wondering, after all 8 of you had moved out, what kind of things did your mother do in that part of her life?
Yeah, well, at first, she struggled at first because she spent 30 years, raising kids. And my mother was, she had the highest IQ in her school. She was the principal, pulled her aside and said, "Look, we did all these IQ tests. You have the highest IQ in the school and probably in the community. And the FBI would like to talk with you. They would like to, have you move to Washington, D.C. and work for them." So my mom, she contacted, my dad and said, what do you think about this? And he said, "No, I'm not going to have a general chasing you around his desk." That was basically his response. So instead, they became married. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she raised us children. But in the meantime, there was it was called CFM. It's Christian Family Movement in Chicago when we lived in the Chicago area. And my parents became advocates for anybody who was in need, whether it was the migrant workers. I remember as kids, I remember a picket sign being put in my hand, and we were marching at the local A&P against the unfair working conditions for migrant workers. We renovated a room in our house and let a migrant family move into our home while the community of people that they associated with, they renovated homes, and then they made, more suitable homes for the migrant workers to move into. So we were a revolving door. Our home, we had people that there was a young man, his name was Gene, and it was during the kind of the aftermath of the Watts riots. There was civil unrest, and we had him in our home for some time, and his dog Socks, which I remember as a kid. But we were like safe refuge for those people in need. And I remember my mom saying too, when I asked her about it, she said, "I know that all of this work was hard on our family, but," she said, "you can't look away from the needs of others." And she said, "Even when no one's looking, you have to do the right thing." So that was, again, that Lighthouse Keepers, way of life. Be the beacon of light for others, no matter what, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess to answer your question, she was we say she didn't have a job, but she was a social activist, and that's what she made her, out of her life. When I went off to school, she was a little bit lost, and she actually didn't know what to do with her life. And she went to see a therapist who said, well, what did you like doing before you had children? And she, had to kind of dial it back and think about it. She knew that she really loved swimming, and she knew that Jesus was really at core in her life. So she took a 5-credit theology class at St. Norbert's College, and she got an A+. But I laugh because I was in college at the same time, and I came home, and one night we were talking, and it was late at night, and I said, what are you doing up so late? And she said, I'm cramming for a test. So we actually reached common ground, and we talked a lot about, her life and social activism. And she basically said to me, I believe that we're all on earth for a purpose. So we're here to serve everyone in ways large and small. So I don't know if it's okay, Jeremy, if I skip ahead to the 2 little stories that
Sure.
took place. But she shared with me that she was on a flight, and there was a businessman. And shortly after buckling their seatbelts, he turned to her and just started sharing with her all these regrets he had. His priorities were wrong, where he spent his time, how he hadn't treated his kids the way he should have, his wife, all of these things. And my mom said she just listened to everything he had to say, and she waited about a minute, and then she said, tomorrow is a new day. So it was never about judging or pretending to know the answers. It was about giving him grace, and also letting him know, like, you have an opportunity to start over, like to try and do better. And so we were always raised to do better and be better. And it's, it's a lot, to strive for. But she told me that story. And then and I said, tell me more. So she said, well, when in 1975, my mom and dad were in a trip in Italy, and they were going to go to a mass at the Vatican. The Pope was going to be saying mass. So they were running a little bit behind, so they jumped on a bus. And when they got on, there weren't 2 seats together. So my mom took the first aisle seat that was available, and she was sitting next to this lady. And this lady was wringing her hands, and she was very nervous, and she was sweating. And my mom didn't know what was wrong, but she just knew she was supposed to calm her down. Like, God had put her in that chair for that reason. So my mom just calmly made a little light conversation with her and just kept reassuring her and calming her down. And my mom thought that was the end of the story. And this was in 1975. In January of 1976, my mother got a copy of the New York Times or Time magazine, and on the cover was a picture of Sarah Jane Moore. And Sarah Jane Moore was on the cover because she had attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford. So my mother said, this is the woman that I sat next to on the bus. And so I asked my mom, well, what do you think happened? My mom said, I think she was going to try and assassinate the Pope. So, and she said, I think I was put in that chair on that day so that wouldn't happen. And so a little mind-blowing.
Wow.
Yeah. So bluebirds. Can you say a little bit about how bluebirds figure in all of this?
Yeah. So after my parents are both retired, they monitored about 150 bluebird houses. My dad built them, and they monitored them for the what's the word? In northern Wisconsin. So in the Forestry Service. Thank you. So anyway, they were monitoring those bluebird boxes. And my dad once said to me, your mother has held more bluebirds in her hands than most people have ever seen. It was just kind of a neat thing. So as my mom, the day she was passing, and I was holding her hand, and my sister Ann was there, and my dad was there, and we were talking to her. And right before she passed, I said, are you ready to go? And my mother couldn't speak at that time, so we would do point for yes and closed fist for no, because she was unable to speak. So she gave me a no. And then I said, are you worried about Dad? And she gave me a yes. And I said, okay, I'm going to go talk with him. So I talked with my dad, and I just said, I know it's hard for you to let Mom go, but I think she needs to go. And I'm going to give you some private time. We didn't want to, my sister and I didn't want to influence what he should say to her at that time, but we knew he had to let her go. So So my dad went in to visit her, and later on we found out that he said, you can go if you have to, which is so cute because he didn't want her to go, but he knew he had to let her go. But anyway, so I said, okay, are you ready to go? And she gave me a yes. And then I said, is somebody here for you? And she said, yes. And she looked in the corner of the room and one tear went down her cheek. And I said, are you excited to see Jesus? And she gave me 2 fingers, which we had never gotten before. And we knew she was going to be passing. So I said, Mom, just go to the light. And then I said, send us bluebirds was the last things we said to her. And she passed so beautifully and quietly and gently, just like she lived her life. And anyway, since then, the bluebirds follow us everywhere. We have bluebird feathers, bluebird sightings. I mean, she's active, man, I'll tell you. And so it's bluebirds. And then, sometimes it's other things. It's rainbows, or a certain cloud formation. But there's a knowing that we have when you experience those things, just like that dream you were talking about, Jeremy, when you experience those things, it's different than just the regular bluebird or the regular cloud. You can tell. And I know that Mom is here with us. The most, I think, profound thing she did was my husband and I were standing on the end of a dock on Bass Lake in northern Wisconsin. And her passing was fresh. It was only a few months. And I leaned back against my husband and I said, my mom was so selfless and so beautiful and so wonderful. And I said, Mom, just show off right now. I yelled really loud. And this star, a shooting star, came across the sky in such a slow fashion and all the way across the sky. And it dropped in the bucket of the Big Dipper. And my husband, Andy, who isn't maybe on the same, I'm so open to everything. He's learning more about spirituality and kind of how all this ties together. But he yelled, "Good one, Vivian," at the top of his lungs because she's powerful. And I do believe there's a very thin veil between heaven and here. And I believe that our loved ones are with us at all times, including my grandpa visiting me in a dream or, my mother dropping a shooting star into the bucket of the Big Dipper. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, I was thinking about bluebirds. I just think there's something magical about bluebirds anyway.
Yes.
They're kind of ethereal, they're so special. So jumping ahead to, your mother wrote articles in her lifetime about her life at lighthouses, and you've been doing the same thing, as you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could say something. We when you and I just spoke like a few days ago, you mentioned that one of the articles you just wrote, you felt like you were being guided in writing that. Could you
definitely.
say a little? Yeah.
So I submitted the article that I referenced in the beginning of the call. So I've written 4 articles so far about the book, and 3 have been published right away, and my background was in sales and marketing, and I know things don't work that easily. It's a little bit crazy, actually. I submitted to the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and that was a wonderful article was published. And then we had, Jeremy, we had our first podcast, and then now this, and with the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, and then our Wisconsin. And then about 3 months ago, I wrote an article. I said, I wonder what the most inspirational, because there's a lot of inspirational breakout stories in the book. So I wonder if I pulled one of those and just to see what would happen with that. So I chose the largest inspirational publication in the world and reaches over 7 million people. And I thought I'm just going to write an article, and I'm going to write an article about when my daughter Jamie was 3 years old and we were playing a board game in her room on the floor. And all of a sudden she started looking around the room, and I said, "What are you looking at?" And big eyes, she leaned forward and said, "Can't you see them?" And I said, "See who?" And she said, "The angels." So there were angels all over her room. And then she grabbed her tummy and she was kind of rolling around. And I said, "What is so funny?" And she said, "One landed on my nose." Mm. And I asked her what they looked like. And she took her little hands and she said, "They're about this big." And she said, "And they're blue in the center, and they're silver and gold and sparkly, and they're flying all over our room." So, I mean, to me, it was just, it was just fascinating that she would experience that type of thing. So anyway, I thought, I'm going to pull that story out and I'm going to write an article. So I wrote the article in maybe an hour, just kind of pulled it together, and I thought I'm just going to send it off. So I did. And then I kind of forgot about it. And they say don't follow up because it's that type of, it's a very professional magazine. You don't want to follow up. It just give them time. And while about 2 weeks ago, I got a notice just saying we're going to publish in their September, October publication. And so then I went back and read it, and I don't know how to describe this, but it's way better than I ever could write. Okay. And my husband says, way to pat yourself on the back. I'm not. I'm saying I didn't write it. Yes, my name is on it and nobody helped me, but I do completely believe that the book was written, or the article was written through me, because it is the story. It is a true story, but it elaborates, and it's really good. I can see why it's getting published, and my name will be on it, but I really have a hard time taking credit for it because I'm just the vessel.
Mm-hmm. I've had a little bit of that feeling at times when I've written before, but as somebody just put an interesting, Ralph just put it up on the screen from the chat. Do you see what it says there? Maybe there's another book in your future.
Oh boy.
Any announcement you want to make this time?
No, not right now. I've thought about, a children's book playing off of this book, because there's so many life lessons that would be great to teach children. But I, it's so fresh for me right now. I'm just enjoying playing with the book and getting it out. It's never been about selling the book. I've donated more books to libraries than you can imagine. Anybody if you have a library and you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to donate the books. It's really about getting the message out, and really about sharing the history of these hardworking, dedicated people that became, beacons of light for others. My grandfather was a beacon of light for my mother, but she became that for others, as well as I do believe that there was divine light in her life that really helped her be that, the safety zone for everyone in her life.
I think you should write a children's book about bluebirds.
About what?
I think about bluebirds.
Oh, bluebirds.
Yes.
That's a great idea. Really great idea.
So would you say that your background and your writing have made you a lighthouse nut?
Well, now I am.
Now
I can tell you, I'm even thinking back to some of the Christmas letters. I would skim them because I was busy. Like, what? Too busy to read this, amazing history. So, but I kept everything. But then when I started writing the book and I started reading it all, and I'm really understanding, looking at when my grandfather first went to North Manitou, they picked blueberries. They shot fox. That's how they hunted, for their food. The work that they did in scrubbing the towers and keeping everything in tip-top shape, and their dedication. There was another, if I can just quickly read something. This is something I found in my mother's journal, where she said, during a terrible ice storm, I saw my father hanging over 100 feet in the air outside the lantern room window. He had tied a rope around his waist and secured it to the outside rail of the lighthouse so he could scrape ice from the windows. There was a sacred trust between mariners and the lighthouse keepers who guided them to safety. Dad was worried about the boats weathering the storm, as he knew they needed his light to navigate. So that sucked me in like no other. I mean, as I've always felt water in my soul, but I feel like now I understand more about where that comes from. I feel like it's in all of us, but I think as a descendant of a lighthouse keeper, I feel like he brought the Great Lakes to us in a way that I'm finally, I'm 64 years old, and I'm finally understanding, what that means to me in my life, and I'm trying to help share that legacy with the other people in our family and the world.
You're very inspiring. Very inspiring.
Oh, thanks.
I just want to mention that Ralph just sent a message to us here. He says your mother's journals show that she was a prolific writer herself, and that maybe you could cull stories from those for a book. What about that idea?
Oh, well, definitely. A lot of her stories are the foundation for this book, but there were stories that are still, I've wondered what to do that. There's a whole book sitting next to this book where I'd move things in and out, back and forth. And, but I don't know how it all works. Somebody wants to take all that from me and make it happen. Or maybe I just have to be the vessel. I don't know. It's beyond me, but there's a lot of stories and there's a lot of history that can be shared. Sure, definitely. And as you started this call, Jeremy, by asking about kind of outreach or the connections with other keepers, and I am just so inspired by the people who are manning the lighthouses today, or those that are preserving in the history, those that are, fundraising, or those that are actually doing the work. It is incredible to me how connected these people are. All of you people on this call, I mean, you're all connected. You all know each other, and now many of you are reaching out to me on social media, and I'm telling you, I love it. So please loop me in. I think what you're doing is fascinating.
Yeah, we're one big happy family. And
Yes.
Speaking of happy families, correct me if I got this wrong, but I think you have 5 kids. Is that right? Yourself?
Oh, me? No, sorry. I have 4 children and 5 grandkids.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. Are your children and or grandchildren, do they have they shown interest in this family legacy and maybe lighthouses as well?
Well, I think, to the degree based on their ages. Yeah. I mean, they're interested in it. So I think the children's book would be, to your point, Michelle, maybe with the bluebird, weaving through it would be interesting. That would, I think, help them. But as I said, I spent my whole life as a lighthouse keeper descendant and didn't understand the impact of it until much later in life. But they're interested in it. They come to the book signings. They come to when I had the Lighthouse book signings, they all show up. We had 50 people came when I launched the book at the Raleigh Point Lighthouse, and from my family from all over the country. And I'm just so grateful. We have a very loving family. I think my mother and my father set the foundation for, raising us not to be little brats. We understand. We were always taught we were no better than anybody else. So, we try really hard to help others, and there's no competition between our family. We all just love each other. So, yeah, boy, if that's even a lesson that we can pass on, generationally, it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wish you could have met my friend Simone Ponsart Roberts, who passed away a couple of years ago, but I co-wrote a book with her called Everyday Heroes, True Story of a Lighthouse Family. Her father was a longtime lighthouse keeper in Massachusetts. You guys would have hit it off so well.
No,
I'll talk to talk more about that with you later. But I just had to put that in.
So I have one more question for you for bonus points. Okay. In our crazy world with so much going on and so many good causes, why should people care about preserving lighthouses?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question. I just feel like lighthouses are more than what they may have served at the time. I mean, there's all kinds of changes taking place. There's automation, there's transfer to the Coast Guard, there's so many, private ownership, but there is just so much history, and there's so much dedication to others and life lessons that come from the lighthouses. And isn't there just something, when you talk to people about lighthouses, they just, not to be,
they light up.
They beam and they light up. And there's just something magical about the lighthouses. But I think it also really grounds you when you understand that you're part of something so much bigger on this world, in this world. And when you watch a lighthouse light go around, you also feel like how insignificant each of us is, but together how great we really can be. So I think preserving lighthouses should be critical, should be front of mind for everybody, I think.
Beautifully said. You just made me think of my friend, the late Connie Small, who wrote the book, The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife. Lived at lighthouses for about 30 years. She passed away at 103 about 10 years ago or so. But she told me that she and her husband didn't see lighthouse keeping as a job. They saw it as a calling. That kind of fits in with a lot of what you've said as well.
This is a story that my dad told me, and then I also found it in my mom's journal. And this is so interesting. And I'm going to read it because it's better in my mom's words. It's real short, but it's an interesting thing. It's called a highball that lighthouse keepers, they did. So even in good weather, this is from my mother, Dad's thoughts were with those who sailed. Some of his shipmates, after many years, had become captain's mates or chief engineers, and he knew which boat each of them presently sailed. Often, as a car ferry or freighter passed by the point, he would give them a highball as he raised and lowered the flag in salute. Then, far out in the lake, he would see a puff of steam and then the sound of horn in their answer. And my mom said, often the captain and the mates, maybe a day or two later, would end up at the lighthouse playing cards. It was a tight community, which ties closely to what we just said about lighthouses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. I'm glad you read that. Therese, there's so much to talk about, and we covered a little bit of the same ground as we did on the audio podcast, but we also covered a lot of new ground, which was great. And there's so many aspects to all this. And it's a beautiful book. That's the word I always think of when I think of the book. It's just beautiful. Everything about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. And it's me that should be thanking you. This is amazing. And I've really enjoyed watching the comments that have been posted throughout. Appreciate everyone taking time to listen and to I'm not going to steal your line and say, keep the line on.
No. Michelle gets that.
That's
but again, thank you, Therese, and Michelle. Thank you so much for co-hosting again.
I really enjoyed this, and it was wonderful meeting Therese.
Thanks, Michelle.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and I'm sure you'll be doing both the audio podcast and the live streams often in the future. So always a pleasure, of course. So at this point, to our live audience and all our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for tuning in, and
keep a good light.